Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fine Print. Today, we're continuing our APUSH Review Series by discussing Unit 6 of AP US History. We start off with 6.2 Westward Expansion and Economic Development. Railroads promoted settlement in the Great Plains and linked the West to the East. During the Civil War, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific started to build railroads from east to west and connected to join the Atlantic and Pacific states. More railroads were built through the late 1800s. Railroads were built in areas with less people with low profit and damaged the West's environment. It almost exterminated the buffalo population, and American Indians were further pushed off of their land. Initially, the Great Plains were known as the Great American Deserts by pioneers, few trees, low moisture, blizzards, and hot summers, which discouraged settlement. After 1865, the plains changed dramatically, and by 1900, buffalo herds were wiped out. Ranches, towns, and steel rails were then built. The California gold rush led to an increased immigration to the West. Mining companies followed, and companies employed experienced miners from Europe, Latin America, and China. Gold and silver strikes followed in the West, and gaining states like Nevada, Idaho, and Montana their statehood. Rich strikes created vibrant towns, but after mining was over, they were often deserted. Ranchers realized the economic potential of grasslands in the West after the Civil War. Cattle used to be raised by Texas by vaqueros or Mexican cowboys, but by 1860, large herds freely roamed in Texas. Cattle drives declined in the 1880s due to overgrazing, blizzards, and droughts, which killed most cattle. Homesteaders used barbed wire to cut off access to the open range, and wealthy cattle owners began using ranching techniques and raising new breeds of cattle. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres of land to family that lived on it for at least 5 years, which encouraged farming in the Great Plains. The first sodbusters, as they were termed, built homes with bricks, and extreme weather, plagues, scarce water, and loneliness challenged these families. However, barbed wire helped to fence land, and by 1900, the Great Plains had seen the failure of two-thirds of farms. However, those who survived used dry farming and planted crops that could withstand the extreme weather. Farmers had become a minority by the late 1800s who faced economic threats, and farming became increasingly commercialized, which led farmers to begin to focus on cash crops for regional and international markets and became dependent on machinery. Increasing crop production led to deflation. Prices dropped dramatically, and farmers with mortgages faced high interest, who were forced to become sharecroppers, middlemen, railroads, and corporations, who kept prices high and taxes property higher than stocks, leading to farmers feeling victimized. This led to the National Grange Movement. They were active in economics and politics to defend members against these middlemen, trusts, and railroads, and established cooperatives, which were business owned and run by farmers to save costs charged by middlemen, and they often passed laws that favored farmers. Farmers' alliances taught about scientific farming methods. They wanted to take political action and could potentially become a political party. Poor whites and blacks joined this movement. National Alliance delegates created the Ocala Platform, which argued for the direct election of U.S. senators, lower tariffs, graduated tax, the federal banking system, and much more. 6.3 covers westward expansion, now social and cultural developments. The Oklahoma Territory opened to settlement in 1889, and after a year it was completely settled in. Turner stated that the rapid settlement was an evolutionary process. Hunters first, then cattle ranchers, miners, and farmers, and then towns and cities were founded, which shaped American culture. However, historians challenged this thesis and stated that the growth of the frontier was interrelated with the growth of towns and cities. Turner saw the frontier as a place for releasing discontent in American society and believed that the frontier being gone would indicate social divisions in America. Pueblo groups, who were Native Americans in the Southwest, lived in permanent settlements. Southwest groups were nomadic hunter gatherers. Pacific Northwest groups developed complex communities. And most tribal groups lived in the Great Plains, who got into conflict with the U.S. government, who tried to limit them to get reservations with strict boundaries. However, the natives refused to restrict their movements, leading to the Indian Wars. The Indian Wars were conflict between American Indians and the U.S. Army over settlement in the West. The U.S. Army was held responsible for many massacres, and the Seal War was won by the natives. The U.S. tried to negotiate for land, but American Indians refused. The Indian Appropriation Act of 1871 ended recognition of tribes as independent nations. The Sioux ambushed the U.S. Army at Little Bighorn before having to surrender, and the U.S. Army pressured tribes to keep moving westward. The Ghost Dance movement and the massacre of Wounded Knee were the last efforts by the natives to resist U.S. government controls, which ended in a bloody massacre that ended the Indian Wars. Assimilationists were a group of people in the eastern United States who believed that these natives should be assimilated into American society to end their culture. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1877 divided tribal lands into plots and required 25 years of residence to become an American citizen. Disease and poverty soon reduced the native population by 1900. There were also concerns over deforestation, which sparked the conservation movement. People advocated for forest reserves, and Americans were concerned about losing lands with natural treasure. The Forest Reserve Act of 1891 and the Forest Management Act of 1897 withdrew federal timberlands from development. Most conservationists believed in regulated use of natural resources, and preservationists aimed to preserve these natural resources from human interference. 6.4 covers the New South. The South began to industrialize as Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina overtook New England textile production. The South integrated into a national rail network, but the North still dominated the Southern economy. The South still remained mostly agricultural. Most people were tenant farmers or sharecroppers and mostly grew cotton. However, George Washington Carver introduced crop diversity. Small white farmers remained in debt and poverty, and poor whites who weren't willing to join hands with poor blacks to boost economic status. The North withdrew protection for the African Americans in the South when Reconstruction ended, leading to the return of democratic power that favored white supremacists. They exerted power by showing African Americans as inferiors. The civil rights cases of 1883 ruled that Congress wouldn't ban discriminatory practices, and Plessy v. Ferguson upheld segregation in Louisiana railroads. Jim Crow laws soon followed. Southern states brought literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses, which stated that you could only vote if your grandfather did, as well as lynch mobs killed many African Americans and contributed to economic discrimination. Two notable individuals during this time period were Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Although their purpose was the same, their ideologies differentiated vastly. Booker T. Washington believed that African Americans should focus on working hard in their jobs and not challenge discrimination. He was supported by many whites, such as Andrew Carnegie and Teddy Roosevelt, because he wasn't directly being violent about the segregation movement. In contrast, W.E.B. Du Bois demanded an end to segregation through black self reliance, granting African Americans equal rights. This was opposed by whites and many blacks who wanted to work against the system. 6.5 covers technological innovation. The workable telegraph by S.V.B. Morse improved transatlantic cable and allowed the sending of international messages. It also internationalized markets and prices, as well as the typewriter, the telephone, and the camera. The Bessemer steel process helped Illinois rise as the center of steel production. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and his lab revolutionized electric power. Light allowed people to work longer hours instead of relying on sunlight. Improvements in urban transportation allowed for the growth of cities, which increased the use of electric trolleys, railroads, and subways. Massive steel bridges allowed for longer commutes between city centers and residential areas. Skyscrapers developed with the Otis elevator and the central steam heating system, and became dominant in offices for industries. R. H. Macy and M. Field made the large department store popular in urban areas. Nationwide chain stores soon opened, and mail order companies used the rail system to ship rural customers goods. Branded packaged food became common and promoted a consumer economy. 6.6 covers the rise of industrial capitalism. Railroads led to mass production, consumption, and economic specialization, which promoted coal and steel industries. And the American Railroad Association divided America into four time zones. Smaller railways were merged with larger systems which connected eastern seaports with midwestern cities. Investors overbuilt, and companies suffered from mismanagement. Speculators soon entered the railroad business for quick profits, and railroads competed by offering discounts to favored shippers. The 1893 financial panic led 25% of railroads into bankruptcy. Bankers moved in to control bankrupt railroads and stabilized rates and reduced debts. Customers and small investors felt that they were victims of financial schemes and corruption. the Granger laws in Midwestern states overturned by South Carolina, and the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 protected public interests. Andrew Carnegie worked up from poverty and employed a business strategy called vertical integration, which meant that the company would control every stage of the industrial process. He produced more steel mills than in all of Britain, and Carnegie soon retired and sold his company to United States Steel. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil that turned into an oil monopoly. When he retired, his net worth was $900 million. Trusts were organizations that managed the assets of other companies. Horizontal integration was when one company controlled all former competitors, completely reducing competition. Vertical integration Vertical integration, implemented by Andrew Carnegie, stated that one company would take control of all stages of making a product. Adam Smith was an economist who believed that mercantilism was less efficient than the principle of supply and demand, and believed that unregulated businesses would be motivated by their own self interest to offer improved goods. Social Darwinism was a belief based on Charles Darwin's natural selection theory that was intended to apply to the market. Concentrating wealth in the hands of the fit would benefit everyone. Protestant work ethic was followed by many businessmen, which stated that material success was a sign of God's favor and a just reward for hard work. By 1890, the richest 10% of the United States population controlled 90% of the nation's wealth. Most Americans ignored the widening gap between rich and poor and instead focused on examples of self made men, who were usually white Christian males whose fathers were also in the same business. 6.7 covers labor in the Gilded Age. Low wages were common because most factory jobs were filled with immigrants, which was justified by the iron law of wages, which meant that raising wages would increase the working population. More workers would join, which would cause wages to fall. Most families relied on the income of the father, mother, and children. Industrial workers worked monotonous jobs, long working days, dangerous conditions, and many were exposed to toxic chemicals. This led to rebellions against these big corporations, and most workers left their jobs. Employers developed ways to counter these labor unions and portrayed them as un American. First, they implemented a policy of blacklisting, which was a roster of the names of pro union workers and was circulated around to make sure the same employee couldn't get a job elsewhere. A yellow dog contract stated that the employee couldn't join a union. Private guards were often forces used to put down strikes, and judicial action used by an employer would also prevent strikes through court injunctions. Some union leaders favored political action. Others wanted direct confrontation, such as strikes, boycotts, and slowdowns, to achieve collective bargaining. In the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, companies had cut wages during an economic depression. Thousands of strikes across the U.S. shut down various factories, and these railroad workers were joined by other industry workers in an escalating strike. President Rutherford B. Hayes used federal troops to subdue the strike, and employers addressed their grievances by improving wages. There were two main unions that were formed during this time period. First was the National Labor Union. It was an organization that championed high wages, an 8-hour workday, and equal rights for women and African Americans. Another group was called the Knights of Labor. They were an initially secret society to avoid detection by employers, and later went public and opened membership to African American and women. They advocated for forming worker cooperatives, abolishing child labor, abolishing trusts and monopolies, and settling disputes by arbitration. In response to the May Day movement calling for a general strike, labor violence broke out in Chicago. A few days later, workers held a public meeting in Haymarket Square. When the police tried to break up the meeting, someone threw a bomb and killed 7 officers, which led to the Knights of Labor losing popularity because the blame fell on them. The American Federation of Labor was an organization that focused on higher wages and improved working conditions and became America's biggest labor organization. The Homestead Strike was a strike in 1892 at Andrew Carnegie's steel plant caused by wage cutting by 20%. Managers used lockout, private guards, and strikebreakers to defend the strike. Later, the Pullman Company cut wages, and workers that bargained with the owner were fired and instead turned to the ACU for help. The ACU tied Pullman cards to mail cards and requested the president to endorse this. But even after a federal injunction, the ACU leader didn't cooperate and was arrested. The Supreme Court allowed for the use of injunctions against strikes, and the ACU leader concluded that radical approaches held the upper hand. 6.8 covers immigration and migration in the Gilded Age. Europeans were pushed to immigrate due to poverty of displaced farm workers, overcrowding, and religious persecution and anti Semitism in Europe. The US was known as a country with political and religious freedom, with abundant industrial jobs and inexpensive travel. Old immigrants during this time period were known as immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, mostly Protestant with higher literacy. New immigrants were the ones that came after the outbreak of World War I and came from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were poor, illiterate peasants who left autocratic countries, largely Roman Catholic or Orthodox, and most returned home after earning enough money in the United States. After gold was discovered in California in 1848, Chinese immigrants flooded the state. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 ended the immigration of Chinese people, but other Asians found work in Hawaii and California. The first South Asian immigrants came in the 1900s, which led to Congress passing immigration restrictions after anti Asia sentiment that effectively ended immigration from the continent, and only Filipinos were allowed to migrate. Most immigrants and internal migrants moved to cities. Streetcar suburbs were communities that grew along transit routes leading to an urban center to escape pollution, poverty, or crime. Landlords divided inner city housing into small rooms as poor residents moved into business districts. Tenement apartments could cram thousands of people into one block. New York City passed a law requiring each bedroom to have a window to increase air circulation. Dumbo tenements were constructed with open ventilation shafts in the center, and overcrowding promoted deadly diseases. Immigrant groups created distinct areas where each group maintained its own ethnic culture. Many groups supported their own schools and newspapers and helped ambitious and hardworking immigrants and their kids to achieve the American dream. Renewed populist protests to keep down the number of immigrants and efforts to discourage new immigration drew upon earlier opposition to the Irish, the Italians, and the Chinese. 6.9 covers responses to immigration in the Gilded Age. Several groups supported efforts to restrict immigration. First were labor unions, who were worried that economic concerns and employers used immigrants to depress wages and break strikes. Employers didn't like immigration because they feared that immigration would advocate radical reforms. Nativists didn't like immigration because they felt that immigrants would take their jobs, weaken Anglo culture, and because they were anti Catholic. Social Darwinists didn't like immigration because they believed that Southern and Eastern Europeans and non Europeans were biologically inferior to English and Germanic heritage. Nativist sentiment pressured California to pass a miner's tax on foreign born miners. Congress soon passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that banned all new immigration from China. The Contract Labor Law of 1885 restricted temporary workers in an effort to protect American workers from competition, and the literacy test was vetoed by the president, however, it was passed by Congress. Nativist sentiment tended to increase during economic depression periods, and immigrants became scapegoats. Political bosses and machine politics also rose in immigrant areas during this time period. Political machines were tightly organized groups of politicians, and each had its own boss, who was the top politician who gave orders to the rank. Political machines often brought modern services to the city and helped find jobs and apartments for urban newcomers. They helped the poor but also stole millions from taxpayers through fraud. Their condition was simple. If we would help you, you would be forced to vote for us, which often increased Democratic victories during this time period. 6.10 covers the development of the middle class. New jobs were created for white collar workers, salaried employees whose jobs didn't involve manual labor, and the middle management needed to coordinate operations. This increased the demand for services from other middle class workers. Many business leaders joined civic and humanitarian organizations. Most young women worked in the labor force. In 1900, men and women believed that a woman's proper role was in the home unless the family needed an additional income. As demand for workers increased, women became doctors, lawyers, professors, and formally took male jobs. As demand for workers increased, women became doctors, lawyers, professors, and often took up jobs that were previously held by men. Certain occupations became specific to females, such as nursing and teaching, but also had lower salaries. In the US, the wealthy and middle class families moved from urban areas to healthy suburbs to escape city problems. Owning a single family home with a lawn became the American ideal for the middle class. Cities tried to carry on life in large cities, but over time, increasing disease, crime, waste, and water convinced reformers of the need for municipal regulation in the development. Elementary schools after 1865 continued teaching reading, writing, math, moral values, so literacy rates dramatically increased. The German concept of kindergarten became common, and there was growing support for tax supported public high schools. The Federal Moral Acts of 1862 provided land grants to states to establish colleges, which focused on agriculture, mining, and STEM careers, which were more affordable for the middle class. Advocates for female education founded new colleges for women. African American education supporters founded African colleges. The concept of electives was also introduced, which allowed students to pick what they wanted to study. Social sciences studies increased as economics became increasingly popular. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard. He was an intellectual who advocated for racial equality. The growth of leisure time for the middle class was due to reduced work hours, improved transport, advertising, and the reduction of the Puritan belief that leisure time was wasteful. Daily newspapers covered sensational and dramatic stories that urged people to read them daily. Circuses also increased in popularity because it improved transport, and transport companies urged leisure time on weekends to promote their business on off days. Jazz, blues, and ragtime became popular and combined African rhythms with European instruments and reflected the pain of the black experience. Spectator sports originated in the late 1800s. Baseball became an urban game, and Jim Crow laws further prevented black players from joining all white leagues. Football also developed as a college sport and soon spread to high school. Values of sports as a healthy exercise gained acceptance. Women were engaged in recreational activities, and golf and tennis grew in the upper class. 6.11 covers reform in the Gilded Age. Books criticizing economics and wealth disparities caused by industrialization increased. They proposed replacing all taxes with single land tax. One book envisioned life in the year 2000, where society eliminated poverty, greed, and crime. Both authors were criticized as utopians and encouraged a shift in American society towards more government regulation. Roman Catholicism grew rapidly as European immigration increased. Catholic leaders defended the Knights of Labor and helped urban evangelists to adapt to traditional Christianity. The Salvation Army provided basic necessities to homeless people while spreading Christianity. Settlement workers and political activists crusaded for child labor laws, housing reform, and women's rights. Urban life strained families and introduced the concept of nuclear families. Divorce rates increased, family sizes reduced, and children became economic assets on the farm, but liabilities in the city. NAWSA was founded by Susan B. Anthony to secure women's voting rights. By 1900, most states allowed women to control property and vote in local elections. Excessive drinking by male workers caused poverty for working class and immigrant families. Organizations formed to promote temperance, and some members raided saloons and destroyed alcohol supplies. Reformers across the country aimed to combat corruption in the city governments but didn't receive much attention. Romanticism and realism became prominent in literature and depicted life in mining camps, which revealed greed, violence, and racism. Naturalism depicted how emotions and experience shaped human experiences. American painters made scenes of everyday workers' lives, surgical scenes, human anatomy, life in poverty, which was called Impressionism, and this art form was rejected until the 1950s. 6.12 covers the role of the government in the Gilded Age. Federal the federal government gave railroad companies large subsidies through loans and land grants to promote progress and expected that the company would sell the land to settlers to finance construction. This promoted poor construction and caused corruption. In Wabash versus Illinois, individual states couldn't regulate interstate commerce. In the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, it required railroad rates to be reasonable and just, and set up the ICC, which could investigate discriminatory practices and prosecute companies, which helped railroads stabilize rates. The Sherman Antitrust Act prohibited trusts to have unchecked power. In the U.S. versus E.C. Knight Company court case, it ruled that the Sherman Antitrust Act could only be applied to commerce. Public outrage after the assassination of President Garfield over the spoils system led to the new president, Chester Arthur, passing the Pendleton Act of 1883, which set up the CSC, the Civil Service Commission, where applicants for classified federal jobs were selected based on exam scores. Farmers and startups wanted soft money in circulation because it would allow them to borrow money at lower interest and pay off loans easily. After the Panic of 1873, Americans blamed the gold standard for restricting money supply and causing the Depression. Easy money advocates advocated for more paper money, or greenbacks, and unlimited minting of silver coins. Bankers, creditors, and investors established businesses wanted hard money, which was currency backed by gold stored in government vaults. They argued that they would hold value against inflation and predicted the dollar to increase in value. In the Specie Resumption Act, paper money unbacked by specie, which was gold or silver, issued to finance the war. Northern farmers benefited from this, but creditors and investors saw it as a violation of natural law. Congress sided with these creditors and withdrew greenbacks from circulation. Supporters of greenbacks formed the Greenback Party, which eventually died out, but demand for increasing circulating money continued. During the Civil War, Republican Congress raised tariffs to protect U.S. industry and fund the Union government. But after the war, Democrats objected to these high tariffs because they raised consumer prices and caused foreign nations to increase taxes on incoming U.S. goods. Farmers thus had to lower prices and got less profits, which led them into deflation. 6.13 covers politics in the Gilded Age. Election campaigns were characterized by crowd pleasing activities. Strong party identification began as a result of regional and ethnic ties. Republicans gained support on the state level, and Democrats in cities. Politics became a game of winning elections, holding office, and providing patronage jobs. Those who didn't play the patronage game were called mugwumps. Political machines, for example, Boss Tweed, who controlled all of New York City's voters, helped immigrants settle into ethnic neighborhoods and get jobs in return for their vote. The city boss controlled city activities. During this time, the supporters of the Democrats and the Republicans varied greatly, as well as their beliefs. Supporters of the Democrats came from the Solid South, which were the ex Confederate states during the Civil War, as well as Catholics, immigrant voters due to political machines, Lutherans, and Jews. Their beliefs were ingrained in states' rights, limited federal power, low protective tariffs, bimetallism, which was the unlimited silver standard. Republicans gained supporters from reformers, African Americans, businessmen, middle class white Anglo Saxon Protestants, Northerners, and upper Midwesterners. Their beliefs resided in temperance, pro business economic programs, high protective tariffs, and often waved the bloody shirt, which was remembering the horrors of the Civil War. They believed in the gold standard, which allowed the wealthy to get wealthier, and wanted limits on immigration. The National Grange Movement and the Farmers' Alliance movements merged to form the Populist Party. The Populist Party was an alliance movement that provided the foundation for the Populist Party. They advocated against concentration of economic power in the hands of trusts and bankers. The Omaha Platform demanded the direct popular vote of senators, using initiatives and referendums where citizens voted directly for laws, the unlimited coinage of silver, a graduated income tax, public ownership of railroads, loans in federal warehouses for farmers, the 8-hour workday for industrial workers, and they also attacked capitalism. The Populist Party didn't gain much support in the North or the South. The Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland won over Republican candidate Benjamin Harrison, which was the first time since the Civil War where a Democratic candidate won the presidency. During the Panic of 1893, overspeculation caused bankruptcy, unemployment and foreclosures increased, and Grover Cleveland adopted a hands off policy towards the economy. The decline in silver prices led investors to trade their silver dollars for gold dollars. Cleveland repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, and Americans believed that the government was a tool of rich Eastern bankers. The Democratic Congress passed the Wilson-Gorman Tariff that provided a reduction in tariff rates and included a 2% income tax on incomes over 2000, but the conservative Supreme Court declared the income tax unconstitutional. Conservatives or Republicans feared a class war between labor and capital. Books taught discontented Americans that their troubles were caused by a conspiracy of rich bankers. The turning point in American politics came in the 1896 presidential race. Cleveland's handling of the Depression discredited the conservative leadership of the Democratic Party, while the populists continued to gain votes. The Republicans nominated William McKinley, who believed in high tariffs and the anti silver coinage. His supporters were often Northerners and Midwesterners. The Democrats nominated W.J. Bryan, a former populist. He believed in low tariffs and was divided on the currency issue. The Goldbug Democrats switched to Republican, and the pro silver party fused populists with Democrats. Their supporters often came from Southerners and poor people. The Republicans nominated William McKinley, who supported high tariffs but was considered a friend of labor. Mark Hanna was the financial power behind his nomination and ran most of his campaigns. McKinley offered Americans the promise of strong industrial nation in America and upheld the gold standards. W.J. Bryan, the Democratic candidate, traveled across the U.S. to sweep voters. His vibrant attitude and rousing oratory convinced millions of farmers that unlimited silver coinage was their salvation. But McKinley, on the other hand, conducted a safe, front porch campaign and relied on Hannah to advertise him. However, Bryan was hurt by a rise in wheat prices, making farmers less desperate, and led to McKinley winning the popular and electoral vote. During McKinley's presidency, farm prices rose, factory production increased, the stock market climbed, and Republicans then enacted the Dingley Tariff of 1897 that increased tariffs and reaffirmed the gold standard. McKinley was well liked and tried to come to compromises and made the U.S. a world power. The Populist Party declined after the election and ceased to be a national party. In the South, populist leaders continued efforts to unite poor people, but soon realized that racism took over common interests. The defeat of W.J. Bryan and populists brought Republican dominance, as the next six presidents would come to be Republican. The Republicans controlled both houses of Congress, became the party of business and industry, and advocated for strong national governments. The election was a big victory for industrial America. President William McKinley is credited as the first modern president. He made America internationally known and appealed to the youngsters of America. The failure of the populist movement didn't end the battle against corruption, and instead led to the progressive era, which is covered in Unit 7.